The world is bracing for the ramifications from the worst attack on Israel in 50 years. Israel is still reeling from the Hamas terrorist attacks that have killed more than 1,300 people, mostly civilians, including women and children. The retaliation strikes against Hamas targets in Gaza have also resulted in well over 1,000 casualties, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. Meanwhile, rockets continue to bombard Israel, but are mostly thwarted by the Iron Dome defense system. And the conflict is expected to escalate as Israel will have to rescue hostages kidnapped by Hamas, including several Americans, which will likely involve an extensive ground operation. There's also concern that Hezbollah, another Iranian-backed terrorist organization, may use the opportunity to strike, and that the conflict could escalate, bringing in other regional powers and groups hostile to Israel and the U.S. We'll get to discuss the crisis and the ramifications for the global economy is macroeconomic and geopolitical expert Michael Wilkerson. Michael is the founder of Stonewall Advisors and the author of the recently published book, Why America Matters, A Case for a New Exceptionalism. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Michelle, good to be with you.
Well, Michael, this is a horrible, horrible situation on all fronts that is fast developing. Latest we know is that the Israeli Defense Force has directed all civilians in Gaza City to evacuate. They're dropping leaflets from the sky. They're sending messages on social media, various apps advising them to move south, trying to avoid civilian casualties, urging them to head towards the Rafah crossing with Egypt, amongst other places, warning of significant military activity in the area in the coming days. A sign that a ground operation is imminent, may already be underway to some degree. Now, it's highly likely that as this happens, Hezbollah may seize the opportunity to launch an attack from the north. That is certainly a concern. In the very near term, and I will break this down into various timeframes and various scenarios, but in the very near term, Michael, how do you see this unfolding?
Well, we're clearly going to see an escalation, as you mentioned. And I think it's important that we try to understand motive around timing. Why did this happen when it did? Because it impacts what's likely to happen next. So the horrible events of last weekend, it's important just to remember that they happened on Shabbat. They happened at the end of the Harvest Festival on a day when all of Israel was celebrating. Internet was, people would put away their phones, communications were relatively down. The guard was off, and that was not unintentional. That was clearly part of the plan. But more importantly, it happened on the 50-year anniversary of the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. This is more than just symbolic. It's symbolic on all sides. But if you think about, what are Hamas's motives, and we can think about Hamas as really being one of the two main militarized arms of the Iranian government, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran itself, we have to recall, formally has called for the eradication of the Jewish state. So the timing is very significant. And what are motives here? So Iran sees two things. Hezbollah sees two things. One, in the near term, which you're speaking of, the opportunity to try to ally the neighboring states. Iran very keenly aware of the threat of the recent rapprochement, the agreements between Israel and the more moderate Muslim states, Saudi Arabia, going all the way back to the Abraham Accords, Bahrain, UAE, and others, looking at what's happened in recent months and seeing this as an opportunity to try to divide the increasing alliance, increasing agreements that have occurred with Israel from those nations. Now, the best way to do that, one way to do that, would be to have the appearance that Israel is overreacting. In other words, to create a view in world opinion that Israel was not acting in proportionality to what has happened, to the atrocities that have been committed by Hamas. Now, that shifting of the narrative is already taking place. You see the media battle going on right now over, what is an appropriate response, what could be done, what should be done. You see governments trying to balance a very thin tightrope between what is appropriate response, what is appropriate support of Israel, and not ratcheting up the escalation ladder, moving into a direction that is going to cause significant escalation of the conflict. I know you want to talk about near term, so let's focus on that. We can get into maybe.
But before we get into that, Michael, I just want to clarify one point. You mentioned some agreements, peace agreements, normalization of ties between Israel and neighboring countries. And yes, we did have the Abraham Accords. Nothing official with Saudi Arabia yet, although there was progress being made to normalize ties between Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, at least some recognition of Israel's right to exist, which would be seen as a major blow to the Palestinian cause and certainly to Iran. And that is why the timing of this attack has potentially linked to an effort to derail those talks. But just to be clear, there has not been any formal agreement with the Saudis or even informal agreement as yet.
That's right. You're underlining the point I'm making, and you're doing a better job of it by saying what Iran was trying to head off was the formalization by agreement of these discussions. The talks have been going on in the last several months to bring these two nations into a more peaceable state.
Correct. And of course, that is problematic to Iran's agenda on several fronts, and also problematic for the Palestinian people who would like to see Saudi Arabia continue to back their cause. But the Saudis have seemingly reportedly been frustrated by the lack of Palestinians' leadership will to finalize or make any progress with any kind of peace negotiations over several decades. That is the bigger picture. That is of big consequence in terms of the broader landscape. But again, I want to bring it back to the very near term, and then we'll broaden out the conversation, and also the very near term in terms of what that can mean for the markets. And yes, this is a humanitarian situation, not to sound callous or cold, but we do want to focus on that angle as well. But assuming this ground incursion happens, what are we expecting over the next 3 days or so, 3-4 days or so?
So the situation is moving very quickly. So I hesitate a bit to be too specific about tomorrow, next day, et cetera, because things will move. But what we do know, believe very firmly, Israel is preparing for a ground movement, which could come imminently within the next few hours. We've also seen in the last several days several events in the north. We've had some limited missile launches, rocket launches, and other attacks from the north, from Lebanon, from the Golan Heights in Syria. Yesterday, Israel bombed 2 Syrian airfields as the Iranian foreign minister was flying in. Today, over the course of, I believe yesterday and today, the Iranian foreign minister and others met with leaders of Hezbollah, met with leaders of Hamas, and it's pretty clear that they are preparing, let's say, to enter the conflict as well. Now, it's important to note Hezbollah is a much stronger force than Hamas. I mean, it is a larger entity, a more sophisticated organization, militarily, diplomatically, financially, and otherwise. Again, all backed by the Iranians, but it adds certainly complexity, and it risks extending the field of battle into a multi-pronged front. It likely brings in other nations, and it risks, of course, expanding this conflict into a regional battle.
Yeah, which would be very devastating, and keeping in mind that there are also Americans directly involved in this, with American hostages being held captive by Hamas in Gaza, which further complicates the situation. Even though this is a super tense, very volatile dynamic right now, Michael, in terms of market reaction, somewhat muted overall, at least in terms of U.S. equities. Hasn't been much concern there. We did see some movement in the precious metals market, gold and silver moving higher ahead of the weekend. Gold now trading back above the $1,900 an ounce level again. Oil up, but mostly due to tightened sanctions against Russia. Again, not to sound cold to the bigger humanitarian plight here, but in terms of what you're expecting as far as near-term market and commodity reaction, what do you think we could see?
Well, it's been very interesting. You said it. The markets have been very muted. Equities have gone nowhere. let's talk about oil for a second. Oil we saw rally from under $70 in May, June to over $90 towards the end of September. Then we had a bunch of technical selling, long positions closing out, options expiring, all that sort of thing. And oil, WTI, fell to around $80 a share from above 90 just a few days before. The reaction that we've seen was to bring oil back to around $85 where it stands today. WTI, the spread against Brent has narrowed. It doesn't feel like the market is pricing in an Armageddon scenario, both in terms of even metals, because gold and silver were going the opposite direction in a bear market over the summer, rising, yes, recently in reaction. It does not feel like the market believes that this is anything other than, to misuse a phrase, a soft landing. In other words, that somehow this will all blow over or not have what many consider to be the potential for very serious longer-term ramifications. So I think that look, I'm still very bullish on oil for all of the geopolitical reasons that we've covered in previous conversations. I do think that that gold has a strong defensive position in this environment. You see what's happening with yields, and while I hate to say it because I don't appreciate what they do for a living, the defense companies are likely to continue to perform very, very well. We saw some companies up by 10% in the last 5 days, some of the weaker performers up by 5%, and I think they're going to continue to perform.
We're also seeing resilience with the dollar.
Yes. And it's been interesting to watch, the dollar move through its phases, of course, coming off of last year, some very high highs, settling into a range. But of course, we know that in times of crisis, the U.S. dollar is a safe haven. And no matter what you think about the long-term prospects, the very long-term prospects for the dollar, given where we are with our debt, et cetera, that's a different conversation. In the near term, in moments of crisis, the dollar does well, and that has always been true and continues to be true.
Well, to your point, it does not seem as though the markets are really pricing in an Armageddon scenario. Let's certainly hope that they are correct. So let's break down the best case scenario out of a very bad situation, a terrible situation. And then I want to focus on the worst case scenario here and what the implications are for markets, commodities, across the board. So best case scenario here. And again, Michael, this is a terrible, terrible situation. There isn't really any positive news that can come out of this, but perhaps that it somehow remains somewhat contained and there are no major spillovers. Is that what we could say is the possible, as I say, best of the worst case scenarios here? What does that look like to you?
I believe that let's go with what the market is pricing and kind of extrapolate from that, which is that it is contained to the region, that Israel's response is proportionate.
When we say region, we mean between Israel and Gaza. We don't mean Hezbollah coming into this fray in any meaningful way.
I think that is inevitable. So I am assuming that Hezbollah comes in. So when I'm saying regional, I suppose it is the borders of Israel. Now, so it is, in my view, inevitable. I don't see a scenario where Hezbollah does nothing. The provocations are there already. Now, I could be wrong. So maybe there's a better than expected best case. But more importantly, what I mean is that the nations of the world get involved in such a way. Let's go back to 6 months ago. China brokered what was an agreement, a reconciliation agreement, unprecedented, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. No one thought that was possible. Iran and Saudi Arabia joined BRICS Plus. They have reasons to find each other here. Now, I think they're terrible bedfellows, and I think it's an unnatural relationship given their history, given the religious differences, given the competition for dominance in the region. Having said that, there is a possibility. We're going with the best case scenario, which I don't necessarily believe in, but a possibility that the global leadership around the world, a measured but proportionate and just response from Israel without falling into the trap of pulling in other nations. And I'm not saying Israel would be responsible for doing that. That's the best case scenario. However, the danger that I see here, Michelle, is that we are in a 1914 type of scenario. And I'm not exaggerating to say the dangers of 1914 were that it is impossible to predict the consequences upon consequences of moving up the escalation ladder, of seeing events that happen. Every party, as you get more parties into this complex situation, has their own interests. And the issue is not even their own interests, but that mistakes will be made, and there will be escalations that are unplanned, provocations that will result in reprisals. So we're in a very dangerous period of time here, a level of danger that I don't believe is being appreciated by the markets, by the general public, and that I think has a reasonable chance of developing into something worse.
Well, what do you make of the fact that we have U.S. aircraft carriers in the region? Is that seen as a deterrent, or is that seen as a potential fuse for this to blow up and expand in an even bigger way?
So it is what I believe the military calls posturing, with a capital P, posturing, showing strength. I think we would call it virtue signaling, or just trying to send a signal. The risk, of course, is that those carrier groups, strike groups, come under attack by unsophisticated means. Consider that what happened with this attack over last weekend was that Hamas went dark. They weren't sending a lot of digital communications. They had gone back to the analog world. The U.S. Navy, U.S. military, the Israeli Defense Force have gotten very, very good at signals intelligence, at understanding how to fight sophisticated modern warfare, human intelligence, being able to deal with lower level analog attacks. So what am I saying is that those strike groups are placing themselves potentially in increasing risk. Moreover, if they wanted to play a role that was beyond posturing or signaling, they're in the wrong ocean. Okay, they shouldn't be in the Eastern Mediterranean. They should be moving to the Indian Ocean, where they actually have a deterrence and a real potential to deal with Iran, which is, of course, the source of all of this. Now, that poses the same risk that I just described in the Eastern Mediterranean. But if you want to think about a real way to detour, those groups are probably in the wrong part of the world.
Are the aircraft carriers there not serving as some kind of deterrent to Hezbollah? Because as you said, Hezbollah is very different from Hamas. Hezbollah has hundreds of thousands of precision-guided missiles made in Iran, transported from Iran and Syria to Hezbollah. So very different from the caliber of rockets that we're getting out of Gaza.
Yeah.
Right?
You make an excellent point, and I think so. One pivot from what I just said would be that the Gerald Ford carrier strike group remains in the Mediterranean, and the USS Eisenhower, which is being rekitted and ready for deployment out of Virginia, will end up going elsewhere rather than as a second group in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Okay, so let's go with the best of the worst case scenarios here. There will have to be some kind of major offensive into Gaza to get those kidnapped hostages, which are reportedly held in underground tunnels that Hamas has dug. Hamas uses money donated to it in order to facilitate this infrastructure of terror and intentionally positions them under civilian targets. Unfortunately, they position these tunnels under UN hospitals, UN schools, and just general civilian targets. So in order to minimize civilian casualties on both fronts, Israel is going to have to go in. If this operation happens over the weekend, it's likely to continue. And again, I know that this is a lot of prognostication, but what are you expecting come early next week in terms of markets? What are the markets looking at for some kind of trigger that you see shooting gold up, shooting the price of oil up? What would be something that could sort of trigger a major market reaction from markets which overall, as you pointed out, are not pricing in an Armageddon scenario?
As terrible as what is happening in Gaza is, and if you think about even all the potentialities of the way that it could play out over the next several days, I don't see anything there specifically bringing about the kind of market reaction you're describing. Now, if there was a major offensive, if there was a dirty bomb, a nuclear, small nuclear device, other things that were outside of the scope of what people expect or is likely to happen, I think then we're talking about a different scenario. In terms of the operation in Gaza, I don't believe that it's likely to create a market reaction. If Hezbollah comes in force, then there is a possibility of reaction. I think one of the concerns that isn't necessarily market related is, of course, that the IDF is building up its capacity. So they've called up, I believe, 360,000 reservists, but they are reservists, and it's going to take some time to bring them up to full operational capability, to train them for the kind of operations. This is the worst possible kind of urban warfare. Urban warfare is the worst possible kind of military action imaginable, and the most difficult to get off and get right. So likely, in my view, is the markets don't really move much opening the week, regardless of what happens in Gaza over the weekend, save for one of the extraordinary events that we just described.
Right. And of course, let's not forget, we've also got the West Bank, Michael. I mean, yes. So far, we haven't had much disturbance from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, other than their support for the Hamas operations. But should the Al-Aqsa's Martyrs Brigade or Fatah, which are in the West Bank, also seize this opportunity to get into the fight, this truly becomes then a multi-front war. Even if it's contained within the borders of Israel, it does then become a multi-front war if you've got Hamas, Hezbollah, and potentially some kind of unrest from either Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa's Martyrs Brigade, or Fatah.
Yes, and I think, so you mentioned the West Bank. I think about today, we're recording this on the so-called Day of Jihad, Day of Rage, where former Hamas leadership are advocating that Muslims around the world stand up, take up jihad in various forms or fashions. There's been a lot of fear and intimidation created around that. But we have seen some things that are already happening where this front is spreading. France today had a very significant attack from Chechen jihadists, and they have now made illegal any kind of pro-Hamas Palestinian protest within the country. There's talk about whether they need to outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood altogether. I give that as an example because after Israel and the United States, France has the third largest community population of Jews in the world. And so I do think this spreading of jihad is sort of an indirect issue, but you bring up the yet another front within Israel's borders.
Okay, so a very tense couple of days ahead. Michael, the bigger concern is that something like this could spiral into what many analysts have said could be a potential World War III scenario here. Yeah. Which is not unfathomable. It is really not unfathomable when you bring in Iran, when you bring in the United States, when you also take into consideration the fact that, Ukraine and Russia conflict is going on. So there are only so many resources that can be allocated to several fronts at a time. There's also concern that China may be watching this and thinking that if this does continue to worsen, this could be a potentially good time, or from their perspective, this could be an opportune time to make some kind of move into Taiwan, with the distraction of all of these other factors. Again, not to be bleak here, but help us understand what the worst case scenario could be and how this could, in fact, spiral into something like that.
Yeah. So let me come back again to motive, which we started to talk about at the beginning, which is we've already talked about that Iran has an existential motive, fundamental motive for the annihilation of Israel as a state. That is their reason for being. That is policy. It's doctrine. That is why they fund Hamas. They fund Hezbollah, all those things that are happening. What have we seen in the last couple of years, which is as the U.S. has shown signs of weakness on the international stage, each actor potentially hostile to the U.S. has begun to act on some of their underlying motives. So we see Iran that was really hamstrung or held back during the Trump administration, now acting much more aggressively. We see China. What are China's motives? So China ultimately wants to have the dominant role in the world system. They want to replace the U.S. financially, monetarily, but also politically and culturally. They are not supporters of the liberal Western democracies. They want the CCP to rule and reign forever. Now, they are very smart about this in that they are playing their cards very carefully. They're laying low and letting others take actions for them. But their motives are very clear. And like Iran, and I would argue like Russia, see this the current weakness in the U.S. administration as the moment to begin to act. So, for example, Russia taking the action it took in the Ukraine under some pressure for NATO expansion to act now during that time. But also note that at the same time, Russia, in addition to the front in Ukraine, have frankly opened up a second front in Africa. How so? Well, we've seen 7 coups d'etats in Francophone Africa in the last 2 years. Each of those have been acted upon, funded by PMCs like Wagner Group and others who are working to undermine, France's influence within that region and to replace it with their own. So Russia taking advantage of the moment, Iran taking advantage of the moment, China taking advantage of the moment. We saw the expansion of BRICS. We saw that that BRICS added Saudi Arabia, UAE, other nations around two BRICS. Now, why? Well, from China's perspective, it was pretty simple. China has only 4% of the world's oil, 4 or 5%. All of the original BRICS had something like 17%. Well, with the expansion of those countries, BRICS Plus more than doubles its oil production capacity. They'll have something like 40% of the world's total productive capacity. So all of these things are interrelated. You have to think about everything that we've seen happening together, including China's overtures to bring Iran and Saudi Arabia closer together. So the worst case scenario is the day of rage, the day of jihad begins to work, and that it begins to work on the minds of the what I've called, whether this is the right name or not, the more moderate Muslim nations. Sympathy begins to shift. It becomes politically untenable for the so-called moderate nations to not back jihad, to not back what is happening with Iran against Israel. We cannot lose sight geopolitically of the fact that Israel is a state completely under siege and has been since its formation. You could put up a map right now and show the vastness of the Muslim nations that have expanded through imperialism, colonization over hundreds of years, and Israel defending a post-sized stamp within this region, its only homeland. So this becomes existential on Israel's side. It becomes theological and fundamental for the Muslims and for the other nations of the world, adversarial to the U.S. system and thus to Israel as the U.S.'s closest ally. The cards could play out that, again, as we talk about with the way this could escalate, that those other nations determine that this is the moment because the U.S. is showing weakness. Well, how is the U.S. weak? Think about it in the following way. The White House has been largely decapacitated from an intellectual capability standpoint. Now the House of Representatives, the lawmaking body, has no effective leader. The horse is riderless at the moment. We have been completely distracted by Ukraine, which I would argue is not, and nor has it ever been, in the U.S.'s core strategic interests, certainly in Russia's, potentially in NATO and in Eastern Europe adjoining states, but for the U.S. it was not. However, Israel is. Well, now we have a challenge of determining how to support Israel when we are weakened financially through the deficits, through the debt, through the support of Ukraine, and a big decision is going to have to be made, that whether to shift from Ukraine to Israel, or what to do if more regional players get pulled in. This has potential, Michelle, to get very, very messy very, very quickly.
Right. And as you say, at a time when the U.S. is very, very, very divided, to put it mildly. Ultimate division in terms of the U.S. and clearly vacuums of power in all senses of the word. I want to focus on the Iran angle here, because let's also keep in mind that Iran is, by most reports, just a few months away from advancing its nuclear weapons capabilities. And Iran has been receiving some funds not aimed towards that, but has had a lot of loosening restrictions with regards to sanctions and its ability to fund its nuclear weapons program. And by many accounts, that is pretty far advanced. Does that somehow result in a preemptive strike taken by either Israel, the United States, some joint effort with those aircraft carriers in the region? If this is indeed this call to jihad from Iran, as you say, and others say it is, at what point does it become necessary to go after Iran directly?
Yeah, so this is one of the vectors, one of the potential avenues of the escalation that could get extremely, extremely dangerous. So you're right that, under the Trump administration, Iran was shackled in many ways from being able to continue to develop its nuclear plans. Many of those initiatives are now back online under the Biden administration. Money has been released. Sanctions have been eased. There's some question about whether the $6 billion that was in discussion last week has or will be released or not. It's not really the issue. The issue is that money is fungible. Money dedicated to humanitarian aid frees up money to be supplied to military or other resources that need. And it's not just the $6 billion. There have been billions and billions of others. Sure. Not to mention the tens of billions of armaments and kit left behind in Afghanistan for whoever wanted to pick them up at the local bazaar. So, specifically to your question, though, the nuclear risk is very real, and this is one of the potential topics that has to be going on in the defense and intelligence communities in Israel and in the United States, which is around Iran's nuclear capacity. Under what circumstances should those be taken out, addressed? It's important here that we all think about and reflect on the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we had hardliners in all countries, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in the United States, and elsewhere, advocating for certain actions that certainly would have brought our nation and the world to the point of nuclear annihilation. And it took cooler hands thinking through diplomatic outcomes to resolve it. I think in this case, we have a similar situation. Iran is, in a way, a two-headed state. You have the secular political power, the president, and all that sort of thing. But the true power is the supreme leader, the religious leaders, clerics, and there are hardliners that are in ascendancy, that are in power, and that are advocating for these more aggressive actions towards Israel, towards the United States. And so, to your question, is that a risk? It is a risk that the U.S., Israel, make a decision to take more aggressive actions against it. I fear that just brings us further and further up the escalation ladder.
Yeah, it can only bring us further up the escalation ladder, potentially. In terms of the bad case scenario, maybe not even necessarily worst case scenario, but in terms of things escalating, not to take anything away from the terrible humanitarian tragedy of it all, but from a portfolio protection perspective, what can one advise? What can one expect? Again, in the grand scheme of things, if it is a Armageddon in World War III, perhaps nobody really cares about what the price of gold is doing. Right. But in some sort of intermediate scenario, what are you suggesting? What are you looking at?
Well, first of all, to frame it, I think the middle case is probably the most likely, or the middle range, because there's no individual case. But I go back to some of the things I was talking about at the beginning of the year, which is I think we're going to continue to see the rise of resource nationalism, one. Two, of shifting global alliances and allegiances that we're seeing this year. We've seen it throughout the year. We talked about BRICS Plus. We talked about Saudi Arabia's moves tilting away from the U.S. and towards China, making strange bedfellows with Iran, etc. Those kinds of trends are going to continue. So the rise of resource nationalism, shifting of global alliances, and with that comes an increasing need to really consider supply line security, food security, energy security. The U.S. is rather uniquely positioned in that we have energy security, or at least the ability to get back to it. We have food security. Europe is vulnerable. Much of the Middle East is vulnerable. Much of Africa is vulnerable. And China has a bit of a checkerboard of strengths and weaknesses here. So I think going back to your focus, the focus of your most of your audience would be around thinking about investment decisions, portfolio decisions, how to protect wealth in this time. And I do believe that it is a moment to be more defensive than usual and to think about the implications of the kind of macro trends that I was just describing. Think about in particular commodities. Think about where global oil markets are. You know, Michelle, we're just one or two accidents or mishaps away from there being a real issue in the global supply chain for oil or gas. seeing, another gas pipeline blown up in northern Europe. We're seeing gas platforms offshore of Israel having to be shut down because of the risk of engagement from rockets or otherwise. None of that has actually moved the markets yet. But what I'm saying is that, again, we've got a depleted strategic petroleum reserve. We've got other issues that, with a couple of more missteps or accidents along the way, could put us in a much worse position. So defensive, thinking about the kind of trends that I just described, and I think the defense companies, the military industrial complex, is going to be in business for quite a while.
Do you see any role for Bitcoin in a portfolio, a protective portfolio?
I do see a role for Bitcoin. It's been in such a doldrum of a market over the last few months. Now, one of the things that's been interesting is to see Bitcoin dominance. In other words, the relative proportion of trading and ownership of Bitcoin and all other altcoins, including Ethereum, really bounce back. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of the speculation and other things that was going on in crypto is being filtered out, and we're coming back to a view of Bitcoin as money, as a hard money alternative. So I absolutely remain bullish on Bitcoin. My greatest concern, greatest fear is that the ideals of Bitcoin, the ideals of being permissionless, of being bankless, of being decentralized outside of the control of government, are exactly the sort of things that governments and regulators despise, and they're very intent on coming after it. So I remain optimistic. I am concerned about, certainly in the U.S., the regulatory environment from the SEC and otherwise. And I think before we could declare victory here, we're going to have to see the regulatory environment shake out in some way. Even getting a Bitcoin ETF fully online, I think, will be a big step.
Right. Well, that in itself may actually jeopardize the whole decentralized idea of Bitcoin, having a spot Bitcoin ETF and having Bitcoin custody potentially centralized with some of these big institutional players that arguably Bitcoin is supposed to get away from. But that is a whole conversation for another time, Michael, whether that's actually a good thing for Bitcoin or not. I want to bring it back to the conversation around oil, because as you said, oil is already hitting what, $89 a barrel just on those renewed sanctions against Russia, given we've got so many significant oil players involved in this market. How do you see oil potentially impacting what we can expect from the Fed? And again, this is in the better of the worst case scenario. If things are somewhat contained to the region, but we still expect some kind of move upward with oil, how does it start to impact the Fed, if at all, in its fight against inflation?
Yeah. It's interesting. And if there weren't much bigger problems that the Fed were having to address, or bigger questions, I think the answer could be it could have quite an impact because of the recessionary implications that high oil prices would normally have. In my view, the bigger issue that the Fed is facing today, today we just got the CPI print for September. We saw that inflation CPI headline is still at 3.7, same as last month. Core inflation, excluding food and energy, still above 4%. So inflation is not going away. Bigger problem number one. Bigger problem number two, and much bigger problem for the Fed, because it's a big problem for the U.S., is that with target Fed funds rates at 5.25 to 5.75, what are the knock-on implications? Well, now interest on government debt. We have almost $33.6 trillion of debt today. We're ratcheting up interest at, I believe it's 1.4 trillion, most recent annualized. We're putting on, therefore, more debt to service the interest to the tune of $30 billion a day. So in other words, we're going to be adding on, a trillion here, a trillion there to the national debt. The U.S. government will not be able to sustain itself with interest rates at 5.5%. It's impossible. We will create a vicious cycle of deficit, what I called in an earlier article, the deficit debt inflation doom loop, because it will just keep circling and the numbers will just keep growing and the debt will start to go vertical on us. And it already is to some degree. So at some point, the Fed will have to pivot. And to me, that is a much bigger driver for the Fed's policymaking decisions than the war itself, than the threat of getting back up above $100 for oil, which I do believe is a possibility, if not a probability, here in the next few months. The bigger issue at hand is what to do about the fact that the U.S. government is driving itself into a fiscal wall.
Right. Look, we're in very, very precarious times. Jamie Dimon saying that this is probably the most dangerous period in time in U.S. history in his living memory. Clearly a lot to see how things develop. Again, it's an absolutely devastating situation for the victims of these terror attacks, for the people on the ground that are suffering because of failed leadership on many fronts. It's a horrible, horrible situation and heart-wrenching on so many levels. Let's hope that from an economic front, as you say, so far the markets are not pricing in Armageddon and that the markets are correct. We, of course, will continue to watch the situation very closely and hope for the best. Michael, thank you for your analysis. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.